Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we move gently into a question that has followed humanity for as long as we have been able to wonder. What happens after death? It is not a question with a single answer, and it has never been. Across time, across cultures, across distant civilizations, people have tried in quiet ways to understand what lies beyond the end of life. Some believed that nothing remained, that death was simply a return to stillness, to silence, to something without form. Others felt that something continued, not the body, but something quieter, something less visible, something that could not be held or fully explained. A presence, a kind of awareness that did not disappear, but moved from one state into another. And in this uncertainty, in this space between knowing and not knowing, entire belief systems began to form, not as answers, but as ways of understanding, ways of giving shape to something that could not be seen. If you listen closely, you may notice that many of these ideas, though separated by distance and time, begin to feel unexpectedly similar, a sense that something continues, not always in the same way, not always with the same structure, but with a quiet consistency that appears again and again. In ancient Greece, death was not always seen as an ending. It was understood as a transition, a movement from the world of the living into a quieter place. Beneath it, the underworld, not a place of fire or constant suffering, but something more still, more distant, more neutral, a place where souls became shadows, not entirely gone, but no longer fully present. They drifted without urgency, without direction, existing in a kind of softened awareness, not punished, not rewarded, but simply continued, like something that has stepped just beyond the edge of light into a quieter space where everything feels more distant. And yet, this was not the only way that death was understood. In another place, far from the Greek world, a different vision began to take shape. In ancient Egypt, death was not simply a transition. It was a journey, one that unfolded step by step, carefully described, carefully imagined, as if the path itself could be followed. The soul was believed to move onward, not into stillness, but into process, into movement, into something structured. There were gates, thresholds, moments that required passage. And at the center of this journey, there was a moment of stillness, a moment of weighing, the heart placed against a feather, not as punishment, but as balance, a quiet measurement of a life that had already been lived, not judged loudly, not decided quickly, but observed carefully, as if meaning itself could be felt in that still moment. And from there, the soul would continue, not into shadow, but into something more defined, more shaped, more intentional, a continuation, but one with direction. And even here, beneath the differences, you may begin to notice something familiar, that same quiet idea that something remains, that something does not simply end, but shifts, moves, becomes something else. And in yet another place, another understanding formed. In the Norse world, death was not quiet, it was not still, it was movement, energy, continuation through action. Some believed that those who died in battle did not fade, but were carried onward into a hall filled with light, with sound, with presence, a place where existence continued, not as shadow, not as judgment, but as participation, as if life itself never truly slowed, but simply changed form. And even in this, where everything feels so different, you may begin to notice that same underlying question, that same quiet attempt to understand what cannot be seen, what remains when everything else falls away. And as these ideas begin to settle, you may feel them become softer, less defined, more open, not something to solve, but something to rest within, a question that does not need an answer, only a quiet space to exist. And as these ideas begin to settle, not as answers, but as impressions, you may begin to notice that across all of these beliefs, there is something quieter that remains beneath them, not the details, not the names, not the places, but the feeling that something continues, not always in a way that can be described, not always in a way that can be followed, but in a way that is sensed, felt, as if awareness itself does not simply disappear, but shifts softly from one state into another. And this question, this quiet curiosity, did not belong only to myth. It moved beyond it, into something slower, less defined, into philosophy, where the question was not only what happens after death, but what it is that continues. What is it that we call a self? Is it the body, which changes constantly, moment by moment, never fully the same? Is it memory, which fades, returns, shifts over time? Is it thought, which appears and disappears without warning? Or is it something else, something quieter, something beneath all of these, something that remains, even when everything else begins to soften? In ancient thought, this question did not have a single answer, but many, some believed that the soul was something separate, something that could leave the body as easily as breath leaves the lungs, not forced, not sudden, but natural, a quiet release, like something that was never fully contained, only resting there for a time. Others believed that what we call the self was not fixed at all, not something permanent, but something that forms moment by moment, a pattern rather than a thing, a movement rather than a structure, like a flame that appears continuous but is never the same, even for a moment. And if this were true, then death would not be the loss of something solid, but the quiet ending of a pattern, the slowing of a movement, the fading of something that was never fully still. And yet, even within this uncertainty, there remained a sense that something in some form continued, not as identity, not as memory, but as presence, a kind of awareness, without edges, without boundary, without the need to be defined. In some traditions, this awareness was not personal, not you in the way you think of yourself, but something larger, something shared, as if the sense of being was not owned, but participated in, like a quiet current moving through everything, not beginning, not ending, but simply continuing. And within this way of seeing, death was not a departure, but a return, not to a place, but to a state without separation, without distinction, where the idea of self becomes softer, less defined, like a shape, slowly dissolving into the space around it. And as you consider this, not as something to understand, but as something to rest within, you may notice how easily the mind moves between these ideas, not needing to choose, not needing to decide, only observing, only drifting from one thought into another, from one possibility into the next. And perhaps this is why across cultures, across time, there has never been a single answer, only different ways of approaching the same quiet mystery. Some imagine journeys, others imagined stillness, some imagined continuation through action, others through silence. But all of them, in their own way, pointed towards something not fully seen, not fully known, but consistently felt, a sense that death is not a wall, but a threshold, not an ending, but a transition, not a disappearance, but a soft unfolding into something that cannot be fully described. And as this idea settles, you may begin to feel that the need to answer the question becomes lighter, less important, as if the question itself is enough, something to hold gently without needing to resolve it, like a quiet space that does not need to be filled. And in that space, thoughts may begin to slow, not because they must, but because they naturally do, like waves that rise and fall without effort, without direction, only movement, only change, and then stillness. And within that stillness, there is no urgency, no need to arrive anywhere, no need to reach a conclusion, only the quiet sense that whatever happens, whatever continues, it does so without pressure, without force, in its own time, in its own way. And for now, there is nothing more to follow, nothing more to understand, only this gentle drift from one thought into the next. And now, as these thoughts begin to soften, you may notice that they no longer feel like ideas, but something quieter, something that does not need to be followed, only allowed to pass gently, like something moving across the surface of still water without leaving a mark. And as each thought begins to fade, another may appear, not with urgency, not with force, but slowly, almost quietly enough to go unnoticed. And then it too drifts away, leaving space for something else, or perhaps for nothing at all. And in this space, you may begin to feel how little effort is required to simply be here, to listen or not listen, to follow or let go. There is no need to hold on to anything, no need to remember, no need to stay with any single idea for longer than it naturally remains. Everything can move at its own pace, unfolding without direction, without expectation, like the quiet movement of the sea, where even in stillness there is motion beneath the surface, slow, steady, unseen. And just as the sea does not rush, neither do these thoughts. They arrive, they pass, they settle, and then they are gone without needing to end, without needing to be completed, only changing softly into something else. And perhaps you begin to notice how the mind naturally slows when nothing is being asked of it, when there is no problem to solve, no answer to find, only space, only quiet, only this gentle unfolding. And within that quiet, there is a kind of stillness, not empty, but full, not silent, but calm, like a room filled with something you cannot see, but can feel softly around you. And in that feeling, there is no separation between one moment and the next, each one blending into another without edge, without boundary, like the slow movement of clouds across a dark sky, shifting without needing to arrive anywhere. And as your awareness rests here, you may begin to notice how distant everything else becomes. Not gone, but quieter, less defined, as if the edges of thought begin to soften and blur until they are no longer something to follow, only something to drift through. And even the question, the one that brought us here, what happens after death, may begin to feel less like something that needs to be answered and more like something that can simply exist without resolution, like a horizon that never needs to be reached, only seen from a distance. And as that question fades into the background, something else remains, something simpler, something quieter, the feeling of being here, of existing, without needing to define it, without needing to understand it, just awareness, resting gently in itself. And in this place, there is no urgency, no movement forward, no sense of time passing in the usual way, only a slow, steady presence that does not need to change, that does not need to become anything else. And like the tide that moves in and out without effort, without decision, your thoughts may continue to rise and fall, coming closer, then drifting away again, each one softer than the last, each one less defined, less distinct, until they are no longer separate at all, but part of a single, continuous flow. And as that flow continues, it may begin to slow even further, becoming quieter, more distant, like something heard from far away, gradually fading into stillness. And in that stillness, there is nothing missing, nothing that needs to be added, only space, only quiet, only this gentle sense that everything is exactly as it needs to be, without effort, without control, without the need to hold on. And as you remain here, or drift further. There is no need to decide, no need to stay awake, no need to follow. You can simply allow whatever comes next to come, and whatever fades to fade in its own time, in its own way, without resistance, without awareness, slowly, gently, until even these words become distant, and then quieter still, and then nothing at all. And as these ideas continue to unfold, not as answers, but as different ways of seeing, you may begin to notice that across cultures, there is not only a question of what happens after death, but a deeper question of what it is that experiences anything at all, because before anything can continue, before anything can move on, there must be something that remains. And this is where many traditions began to look more closely, not at the world beyond death, but at the nature of the self. In some ancient philosophies, particularly in early Indian thought, the self was not seen as something temporary, but something continuous, unchanging, beneath everything else. This idea, often described as the Atman, was not the body, which ages and shifts, not the thoughts, which appear and disappear, but something deeper, a kind of awareness that does not move, even as everything around it changes. And if this were true, then death would not affect that awareness at all. It would only change what surrounds it, like removing a layer, while something beneath it remains exactly the same. And within this way of seeing, life itself becomes only one expression of something much larger, a brief form taken by something that continues before it and after it. And yet, in other traditions, this idea was understood very differently. In early Buddhist thought, the idea of a permanent self was questioned entirely. It was suggested that what we experience as self is not a single thing, but a collection of changing parts, sensations, memories, perceptions, patterns of thought, all moving, all shifting, none remaining the same, even for a moment. And if this were true, then there would be nothing fixed, nothing permanent to carry forward after death. But even here, there was still a kind of continuation, not of a self, but of process, of cause and effect, of one moment giving rise to another, like a flame passed from one candle to the next. Not the same flame, but not entirely separate. And in this way, death was not seen as an ending, but as a transformation, a continuation without a fixed identity. And as different as these ideas may seem, they begin to echo something familiar, the same quiet sense that something does not simply stop, but changes, whether that change is understood as a soul continuing, a journey unfolding, or a process carrying forward. In ancient Chinese thought, there was also a belief that the human being contained multiple aspects, not a single soul, but layers. Some believed that one aspect remained connected to the body, while another moved on, continuing in a different form, as if existence itself could divide, not into loss, but into transformation. And within this perspective, death was not a disappearance, but a redistribution of what once felt like a single identity into something more diffuse, more spread out, more connected to everything else. And as you listen to these ideas, you may begin to notice that none of them speak with certainty, none of them claim to fully explain what cannot be seen. Instead, they move around the question, approaching it from different directions, offering different shapes to something that does not hold a single form. And perhaps this is why the idea of death has never settled into one answer, because it is not something that can be observed directly, only imagined, only felt, only approached through thought, through story, through belief. And yet, within all of these perspectives, there remains a kind of quiet consistency, a sense that what we experience is not isolated, not separate, but part of something larger, whether that something is understood as soul, as awareness, as process, or as connection. And as this understanding begins to settle, you may feel that the question itself begins to change, not disappearing, but softening, becoming less defined, less urgent, as if it no longer asks for an answer, but simply exists as part of a larger awareness that does not need to resolve it. And in that space, between knowing and not knowing, between form and formlessness, between beginning and continuation, there is no need to decide, only to notice how these ideas move, how they shift, how they slowly become quieter, as the mind itself begins to follow that same movement, slowing, softening, becoming less focused, less structured, as if thought itself is beginning to drift into something more open, more spacious, more still. And as that stillness deepens, there is nothing more to hold on to, nothing more to understand, only the quiet sense that whatever continues does so without effort, without urgency, in its own time, in its own way. And as these ideas continue to unfold, not as fixed answers, but as different ways of seeing, there is another question that begins to take shape, one that moves quietly beneath all the others. If something continues, what is it that continues? And how does it remain the same if everything we recognize is always changing? In ancient Greece, this question was explored not only through myth, but through philosophy, through slow reflection, through careful thought about the nature of the soul. Plato, one of the earliest philosophers to consider this deeply, suggested that the soul was not something created at the moment of birth, but something that already existed before the body and would continue after it. In this way, life itself was not a beginning, but a kind of arrival, a temporary state where something older, something more constant, took on form for a time, and within this form, the soul became connected to memory, to perception, to identity. But Plato believed that these things were not the soul itself, only reflections, only temporary expressions, like shadows cast by something more real, more stable, more complete. He described the physical world as something that changes constantly, nothing remaining the same, nothing lasting. And yet, within that constant change, there seemed to be something, that recognized it, something that observed, that experienced, that remained present, even as everything else shifted. And this, he believed, was closer to the true nature of the soul, something not bound to the same rules as the body, not aging, not fading, not dependent on physical form. And if this were true, then death would not be the end of that awareness, but the moment when it is no longer tied to something temporary, like stepping out of something that was never permanent into something that always was. And yet, even within this idea, there remained uncertainty, because if the soul continues, what happens to memory? What happens to identity? What happens to the sense of being a particular person? In many traditions, this question was answered in different ways. Some believed that memory faded slowly after death, not suddenly, but gradually, like something dissolving over time, until what remained was no longer tied to a specific life, but existed in a more general, more abstract way. Others believed that memory remained intact, that identity continued, that the person in some form remained themselves, recognizable, continuous, able to experience as they once did. And between these two ideas, there is a quiet tension, one that has never fully resolved, because if memory fades, then what remains may no longer feel like the same self. And if memory remains, then something must exist that holds it, that preserves it, that carries it forward. And so the question returns, not answered, but expanded. What is the self if it can change? What is identity if it can fade? What remains if everything that defines us is temporary? And as these questions deepen, they begin to move away from clear ideas and into something more open, more uncertain, more difficult to define. In some philosophical traditions, the self was compared to a river, something that appears continuous, something that seems the same from moment to moment, and yet never contains the same water, even for an instant, always moving, always changing, always becoming something new while still appearing to be one thing. And if this is true, then what we call identity may not be something fixed, but something that forms through continuity, through connection, through the flow of experience, rather than through permanence. And if identity itself is not fixed, then death may not remove something solid, but interrupt a process, a movement, a continuity. And yet, even then, there remains the question of whether that movement truly ends or simply changes direction, continues in another form, unseen, unrecognized, but still connected to what came before. And as you listen to these ideas, you may begin to notice that they do not move in a straight line. They return again and again to the same quiet uncertainty, the same sense that something is there but cannot be fully known, cannot be fully described, only approached from different directions, through different ways of seeing. And this may be why the question itself has never settled into a single answer, because it is not something that can be observed, only something that can be considered, felt, imagined, and in that way it remains open, not incomplete, but expansive, like something that continues without needing to conclude. And as this openness deepens, the mind may begin to slow, not because it must, but because there is no longer anything to resolve, no final understanding to reach, only this quiet movement from one thought into the next, each one softer, less defined, less separate, until even these ideas begin to feel distant, like something heard from far away. And within that distance, there is space, more space than before, wider, quieter, more still. And in that stillness, the question itself, what remains, what continues, what is the self, begins to fade, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer needs to be held. And in its place, there is only this quiet awareness, this gentle presence that does not ask does not explain, only exists without effort, without urgency, without the need to become anything else. And as everything continues to soften, thought, identity, memory, even the sense of time may begin to loosen, becoming less defined, less structured, less necessary, until there is only this quiet state, this slow unfolding, this gentle drift where nothing is required and nothing needs to be known. And as these ideas continue to settle, not forming a single answer, but moving slowly around the same quiet question, another way of understanding begins to appear, not through myth, not through philosophy alone, but through observation, through the simple act of noticing what it feels like to approach the edge of consciousness itself, because long before anything could be written, long before belief systems were formed, there were moments, small, quiet moments, where awareness itself seemed to shift, where the sense of being fully present began to soften, not disappear, but change. And in these moments, people began to notice that consciousness does not remain exactly the same from one state to another. It moves gradually, almost imperceptibly, from clarity into something less defined, from focus into something more open, more diffuse. And this movement, this quiet transition, began to shape another way of understanding death, not as a single moment, but as a process, a gradual shifting from one state of awareness into another. In some traditions, this transition was compared to falling asleep, not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, as the boundaries of thought begin to loosen, as the sense of self begins to soften, as awareness itself begins to drift away from structure and into something less defined. And within this comparison, death was not seen as something violent, not something abrupt, but something gradual, something that unfolds layer by layer, like a series of quiet steps, each one softer than the last. And in certain ancient traditions, particularly in early Persian belief, this transition was imagined as a crossing, not immediate, but approached over time, the soul moving toward a bridge, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual nearing, a movement toward something that could not yet be seen clearly. And when that moment came, it was not only the action of crossing, but the experience of it that mattered, because what was carried forward was not just existence, but the imprint of a life already lived, the quiet accumulation of choices, of actions, of intention, not judged loudly, not declared, but present as something that could be felt within that transition. And even here, within this image of movement, there is something familiar, the same quiet sense that death is not a single point, but a passage, something that unfolds rather than happens. And in other traditions, this unfolding took on a different form. In some early Mesoamerican beliefs, what followed death was not determined by how someone lived, but by how they died. A life ending in battle, in water, in illness, each one leading, not to the same place, but to different paths, different continuations, as if the moment of transition itself shaped what came next. And this idea introduces something different, not judgment, not neutrality, but variation, the sense that continuation is not the same for everyone, but changes depending on the nature of the final moment. And yet, even within this difference, there is still that same underlying pattern, that something continues, that something moves, that something does not simply end, but changes in ways that are shaped not only by belief, but by experience. And as these perspectives begin to overlap, you may begin to notice how each one, though different in form, returns to the same quiet idea. That awareness does not stop suddenly, but shifts softly, gradually into something else. And this idea has appeared again and again, not always in words, not always in stories, but in observation, in the simple noticing of how consciousness behaves, even within life itself, because even now, in ordinary moments, awareness moves between states without effort, from focus into drifting, from clarity into softness, from thought into silence. And if this movement is already part of experience, then it becomes easier to imagine that death may follow a similar path, not as an abrupt end, but as a continuation of something that is already happening in quieter forms every day. And as this idea settles, it may begin to change the way the question feels. No longer something distant, no longer something separate, but something connected to experience itself, to awareness itself, to the quiet movement of thought, of perception, of presence. And in that connection, the question of what happens after death becomes less about what comes next and more about what is already here, what is already unfolding in each moment, in each shift of awareness, in each quiet transition from one state into another. And as this understanding deepens, not through effort, but through noticing the need to define it, may begin to soften, to loosen, to fade, like something that no longer requires an answer, only observation, only presence, only this gentle awareness of how everything continues to move, to shift, to unfold without urgency, without force, in its own time, in its own way. And as this movement continues, the mind may begin to slow again, not because it must, but because there is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to reach, only this quiet unfolding from one thought into the next, each one softer, each one less defined, until even these ideas begin to feel distant, like something heard from far away. And within that distance, there is space, wide, open, quiet, a place where nothing needs to be held, nothing needs to be understood, only allowed to pass gently, without effort, without awareness. And as these ideas continue to take shape, it becomes clearer that across cultures, the question of what happens after death was rarely separate from another question: what determines what happens next? Because for many ancient civilizations, death was not the final moment, but a transition, into a state that was influenced not only by existence, but by action, by behavior, by the way a life had been lived. In ancient Egypt, this idea was expressed through the weighing of the heart, a moment not of sudden judgment, but of balance. The heart, placed against a feather, representing truth, order, and harmony. And in that quiet comparison, it was believed that the nature of a person's life could be felt, not measured by words, not explained, but revealed through something deeper, something inherent. And if the heart remained light, aligned with that sense of order, then the soul would continue into a place of peace, of stability, a continuation, not of struggle, but of rest. But if it was heavy, burdened by imbalance, then the continuation changed, not as punishment alone, but as consequence, as a reflection of what had already been lived. And this idea that what happens after death is shaped by life itself appears again in different forms. In early Persian belief, this moment of transition was described as a crossing, a passage over a bridge where the path forward was not the same for everyone. For some, it remained wide, stable, easy to cross, and for others, it became narrow, uncertain, difficult to navigate, not because the bridge had changed, but because the experience of it was shaped by the life that came before. And within this perspective, death was not random, not detached, but connected directly to how one existed while alive. And yet, in other traditions, this connection was understood differently. In ancient Greece, while there were ideas of reward and distinction, such as the Elysian fields, for those remembered as heroic or extraordinary, many souls were believed to enter a more neutral state, the asphodel fields, a place not defined by suffering, but by quiet continuation, where existence carried on without strong emotion, without clear purpose, almost as if life had softened into something more distant, less intense. And within this idea, there is something important, the suggestion that not all beliefs focused on judgment, some focused instead on continuity itself, on the idea that existence does not need to be evaluated in order to continue, only allowed to change. And this contrast between judgment and neutrality appears again and again across cultures. Some imagined a structured afterlife with clear outcomes, clear paths, clear destinations. Others imagined something quieter, less defined, a continuation without sharp distinction. And in the Norse tradition, this distinction took another form, where the nature of death, rather than moral judgment, was believed to shape what came next. Those who died in battle were said to be carried to Valhalla, a great hall where existence continued through presence, through gathering, through shared experience, not a place of rest alone, but a continuation of identity, of action, of participation. And others, those who did not die in this way, were believed to move elsewhere, to different realms, each one reflecting a different kind of continuation. And in this way, death was not a single path, but many, each shaped not only by belief, but by circumstance, by experience, by the nature of the final moment. And as these ideas begin to come together, you may notice something that remains consistent, even within their differences. That death is almost never described as complete absence, almost never imagined as nothing at all. Instead, it is described as continuation in different forms, different structures, different experiences, but continuation nonetheless. And this may be because the idea of complete absence is difficult to imagine, difficult to hold in the mind. And so, across cultures, across time, people have returned again and again to the idea that something remains, even if it changes, even if it becomes quieter, even if it no longer resembles what it once was. And as this pattern becomes clearer, the question itself begins to shift, not disappearing, but evolving from what happens after death into something more subtle, what continues, and in what form. And in that shift, there is no need to decide, No need to choose between these ideas, only to notice how each one approaches the same quiet mystery in its own way. And as you continue to listen, you may feel that these ideas no longer need to be followed closely, no longer need to be understood completely, only allowed to settle gently, like something placed softly into still water, creating small ripples that fade without effort, without urgency, until the surface becomes calm again and everything returns to quiet. And as these different ideas begin to settle, not as competing answers, but as reflections of how humans have tried to understand what follows the end of life, another pattern begins to emerge, one that appears across different regions in different forms, but carries a similar structure. The idea that what happens after death is not only a continuation, but a form of evaluation, not always harsh, not always immediate, but present in some way. In early Zoroastrian belief, one of the oldest known systems to describe this clearly, the soul was believed to approach a bridge known as the Chinvat Bridge, a crossing point between one state and another. And here, what had been lived was not forgotten, not erased, but encountered again, not as memory alone, but as experience. If a life had been lived with balance, with honesty, with alignment, the bridge would feel wide, stable, easy to cross. But if not, it would narrow, becoming difficult, uncertain, almost impossible to pass. And within this image, there is something important. The idea that what comes after death is not separate from life, but shaped by it, not something assigned, but something revealed. And this concept would later influence other belief systems, including early Abrahamic traditions, where the idea of judgment became more defined, more structured, more clearly described. In these traditions, death was often understood as the beginning of a transition into a state where the soul would be held until a final moment of evaluation. And in that moment, what had been done, what had been chosen, what had been carried throughout life would determine what followed. Heaven hell, or something in between. Not simply places, but states of existence, reflecting what had already been formed within the person. And while these ideas became more detailed over time, more structured, more clearly defined, they still carried something familiar, the same quiet suggestion that life does not end without consequence, without continuation, without movement into something shaped by what came before. And yet, even within these systems, there remained variation, because not all traditions imagined this judgment as immediate. Some believed that after death there was a waiting, a period of stillness, before anything was decided, as if the transition itself required time, required distance from the life that had just ended. And in others, the transition was immediate, the continuation unfolding, without pause, without delay, as if the boundary between life and what follows was thinner, less defined, easier to cross. And as these ideas continue to unfold, you may begin to notice that the question of what happens after death is not only about continuation, but about meaning, about whether what is done in life carries forward in some way into what follows. And this question has remained throughout history, not fully answered, but continually explored through different beliefs, different systems, different ways of seeing. Some imagined a clear structure, a path that could be understood, described, followed. Others imagined something less defined, less certain, a continuation without clear direction, without fixed outcome. And between these two, there is a spectrum, a range of possibilities, rather than a single conclusion. And as you listen to these ideas, you may begin to notice that they are not separate from one another, but connected, each one offering a different way of approaching the same question: what continues and how? And in that question, there is something that does not change, a sense that existence does not simply stop, but transforms in ways that are shaped by belief, by experience, by interpretation. And as this understanding begins to settle, you may feel that the need to resolve it, to decide what is true, begins to soften, becoming less important, less immediate, because across all of these traditions, across all of these perspectives, there has never been a single answer, only different ways of approaching something that cannot be fully known. And yet, the effort to understand it continues, not because it must, but because it is natural, because the awareness that asks the question, the same awareness that wonders what happens when it is no longer here. And as that awareness begins to slow, begins to soften, these ideas may begin to feel more distant, less defined, not disappearing, but settling, like something placed gently into stillness. And within that stillness, there is no need to follow every idea, no need to hold on to every detail, only to allow them to move, to fade, to settle in their own time. And as they do, the mind itself may begin to follow that same movement, slowing, softening, becoming quieter, as if the need to think, to understand, to continue is gradually being released, layer by layer, until there is only this quiet presence, this gentle awareness, resting without effort, without urgency, without the need to become anything else. And as all of these ideas begin to gather, not as separate beliefs, but as different ways of seeing, it becomes possible to notice that they can be understood, not only as individual traditions, but as patterns, recurring ways in which humans have tried to answer the same quiet question: what happens after death? And when these patterns are observed closely, they begin to fall into a few gentle forms, not exact categories, but tendencies, ways of imagining continuation that appear again and again in different places, in different times. The first is the idea of continuation as presence, a quiet existence without strong change, without sharp distinction. In ancient Greece, this could be seen in the asphodel fields, where most souls were believed to go, not punished, not rewarded, but simply continuing in a softened state, a form of awareness without urgency, without intensity. And this same idea appears in other traditions as a kind of shadow existence, a continuation that is neither joyful nor painful, but calm, neutral, like something that remains after everything else has quieted. And within this way of seeing, death is not something that transforms completely, but something that reduces, that softens, that quiets, until what remains is only the most essential form of being. And this idea offers a kind of stillness, a sense that nothing is forced, nothing is required, only continued in a quieter way. The second pattern is continuation as journey, a movement from one place to another, not immediate, but unfolding step by step. In ancient Egypt, this journey was described in detail, with gates, with trials, with moments of passage, each one shaping what came next. And similar ideas appear in many traditions where the soul does not simply arrive, but travels through a series of transitions, as if existence itself must be crossed rather than entered all at once. And within this perspective, death is not an end, but a beginning of movement, a process that takes time, that unfolds gradually, like something being revealed, one step at a time. The third pattern is continuation as transformation, not remaining the same, not traveling as a fixed identity, but becoming something else. In philosophical traditions, particularly in early Indian and Buddhist thought, this transformation is not seen as loss, but as change, a continuation without a fixed self, without a permanent identity, but still connected to what came before, through cause, through effect, through continuity of process. And in this way, death does not preserve, but alters, does not carry forward in the same form, but reshapes into something new. And this introduces a different understanding that what continues may not be recognizable in the way we expect, but is still part of a larger unfolding. The fourth pattern is continuation as evaluation, where what follows death is shaped by what came before. In Zoroastrian belief, in early Abrahamic traditions, and in various other systems, this idea appears clearly: a crossing, a judgment, a moment of reflection where the life that was lived becomes part of what follows. And within this view, death is not neutral, not the same for all, but responsive, shaped by action, by intention, by experience. And this creates a sense that existence continues in a way that reflects what has already been formed. And finally, there is a pattern that moves beneath all the others, less defined, less structured, but present in almost every tradition. The idea that death is not fully knowable, that whatever happens cannot be described completely, cannot be observed directly, only imagined, only approached through belief, through thought, through story. And this final pattern is perhaps the most consistent, because no matter how detailed the belief, no matter how structured the system, there is always a point where explanation ends and uncertainty remains. And as these patterns begin to settle, you may notice that none of them cancel each other out. None of them fully replace the others. Instead, they exist alongside one another as different ways of approaching the same mystery. And in that coexistence, there is no need to choose, no need to decide which one is correct, only to observe how each one reflects a different way of understanding what cannot be fully known. And as this observation continues, the mind may begin to slow again, not because there is nothing left to think, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The question remains, but the urgency around it begins to fade, softly, gradually, like something being released. And in that release, there is space, more space than before, wider, quieter, more still. And within that space, these ideas, these patterns, these ways of seeing begin to feel more distant, less defined, not disappearing, but settling. like something placed gently into still water, and as the surface becomes calm again, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to hold on to, only this quiet sense that whatever happens after death, whether it is presence, journey, transformation, or evaluation, it unfolds without urgency, without force, in its own time, in its own way. And for now, there is no need to go further, no need to reach beyond this moment, only to rest within the understanding that the question itself can remain without needing to be answered. And as all of these ideas continue to settle, not forming a single answer, but remaining as different ways of seeing, there is one final way to approach the question of what happens after death, not by asking what comes next, but by looking more closely at what is happening right now, because across all of these traditions, whether they describe continuation as presence, as journey, as transformation, or as evaluation, they all begin from the same place. The experience of being aware in this moment, and this awareness, this quiet sense of being, is something that can be observed directly, not imagined, not believed, but noticed as it moves, as it changes, as it shifts between states, and even within a single day. This awareness does not remain constant. It moves from clarity into distraction, from focus into drifting, from wakefulness into sleep. And in each of these transitions, something subtle occurs, the sense of self, the feeling of being a defined identity, begins to soften, to loosen, to become less fixed. And as this happens, it becomes possible to notice that the self is not as solid as it once appeared, not as continuous, not as unchanging, but something that forms and dissolves again and again in quiet ways throughout experience. And if this is already happening in small transitions, in ordinary moments, then it suggests something important, that the boundary between states of awareness is not sharp, not absolute, but gradual, soft, almost imperceptible, And this idea appears again in different forms throughout ancient thought. In Greek philosophy, there were suggestions that the soul becomes clearer as it separates from the distractions of the body, as if awareness itself is not diminished but revealed when it is no longer tied to sensation, to movement, to physical form. In Egyptian belief, the continuation of the soul was not imagined as a sudden change, but as a process, one that unfolded in stages, as if awareness itself needed time to adjust, to move, to shift into something else. In philosophical traditions, where the self is seen as a process rather than a fixed entity, this transition becomes even more subtle, not something that happens once, but something that is always happening in small ways, moment to moment. And in this way, death is not entirely separate from life, but an extension of something that is already occurring on a smaller scale throughout experience. And as this idea begins to settle, you may notice that the question itself, what happens after death, becomes less distant, less separate, and more connected to what is already unfolding in quiet ways within awareness itself. And in that connection, there is no need to reach for something beyond, no need to imagine something far away, only to notice how everything moves, how everything shifts, how everything changes without needing to be controlled, without needing to be understood completely. And as this noticing deepens, the mind may begin to slow further, not because there is nothing left to think, but because thinking itself becomes less necessary, less urgent, less defined. And in that slowing, there is space, wider, quieter, more open than before. And within that space, the patterns you have heard, presence, journey, transformation, evaluation, begin to blend, not as separate ideas, but as parts of a single movement, different ways of describing the same transition from one state into another. And as these ideas blend, they begin to lose their edges, becoming softer, less distinct, less separate, until they are no longer something to follow, only something to rest within. And in that rest, there is no need to choose, no need to decide, only to allow everything to remain as it is, unresolved, unfixed, but complete in its own way. And as this continues, the sense of time may begin to shift again, moments stretching, becoming less measured, less structured, as if the movement from one moment to the next no longer needs to be tracked, no longer needs to be followed, only experienced as a slow unfolding, without direction, without urgency. And within that unfolding, the question itself, what happens after death, begins to fade, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer needs to be held. And in its place, there is only this quiet awareness, this gentle presence that does not ask, does not explain, only exists without effort, without urgency, without the need to become anything else. And as this awareness continues, it may begin to feel as if there is less separation between one moment and the next, less distinction between thought and silence, between presence and absence, as if everything is moving toward a kind of stillness that does not need to be defined. And in that stillness, there is nothing missing, nothing that needs to be added, only space, only quiet, only this gentle sense that everything continues in some form, in some way, whether it is noticed or not. And as you remain here or drift further, there is no need to stay with these words, no need to follow them, no need to remain awake for them. You can simply allow whatever comes next to come, and whatever fades to fade in its own time, in its own way, without effort, without awareness. Slowly, gently, until even these words become distant, quieter, less defined, as if they are no longer something to hear, but something to drift away from. And as they fade, there is only this quiet space, this stillness, this softness, where nothing is required and nothing needs to happen next. Only rest, only stillness, only the quiet continuation of whatever remains, beyond thought, beyond question, beyond the need to understand.